Hey guys, I'm Taufik. In this video, I'm going to share with you my top 25 SQL interview questions which I have come up with my own experience of using SQL over the past 12 years of my career. Now, during my career, I have taken several SQL interviews and I have given several SQL interviews myself. So all of these questions are based on my own experience. Now, if you're someone who is planning to attend an SQL interview or you're someone who is learning SQL, then I highly recommend that you go through these 25 SQL questions and also all the SQL concepts that are covered in these questions. And try to check if you're able to answer all of these questions yourself. I strongly believe if you're comfortable with all the concepts that are covered in these 25 SQL questions, then you should be in pretty good state to clear any SQL interviews. Now, most of the SQL questions that I'll be covering in this video are going to be theoretical or covering some SQL concepts. I'll not be covering a lot of SQL queries. And the reason for that is I've already made separate videos covering the SQL queries that you should be familiar with to clear SQL interviews. So I'll leave a link to those videos in the description below, or you should find it somewhere in the screen now. Okay, so what I have done is I have written a blog on my website where I have mentioned all of these 25 SQL questions and also the answers to these 25 SQL questions. Now I'll leave a link to my blog in the description below so you can check that out. But before you go and check that blog out, first try to watch this entire video, because in this video I'm going to quickly go through these 25 SQL questions and then may provide some additional information about some of these questions which may help you to clear some SQL interviews. Okay, so before I can start, I understand from YouTube analytics that almost 90% of my viewers do not subscribe to my channel. So if you are one of them and if you think that you have watched any one of my video where you have found some value, then do consider subscribing. Also, if you think that this video is going to help you in one way or the other, then please make sure to like this video. Thank you, and let's begin. Okay, so I'll be going through these 25 SQL questions from my blog itself. Now, as I told you, I'll quickly go through these 25 questions and try to give you some additional information which you may not find on my blog. So try to check this video completely before you go into my blog. And for all the answers, you can refer to my blog. So I'll not be covering all the answers in this video because I want to keep this video as short as possible. So just trying to give you all the questions and the concepts that you need to prepare for an SQL interview. Okay, so let's begin. Okay, so this is basically how my blog would look like. Top 25 SQL interview questions. You would see some introduction and then you would find the link to this particular video, and then you have the questions. So the question number 1 is, what are DDL and DML languages? Now, this is the most basic question that can be asked, especially if you are planning to attend an SQL interview for a fresher role or for a beginner role. Now, this DDL, DML, DCL, TCL and DQL, these are the 5 languages that are available in SQL, and these are the most fundamental concepts in SQL. So it's very important to understand what are the difference between these languages and what are the different statements that are available under each of these languages. Okay, so this is going to be my very first question, and you would find all the explanation to all of these 5 different languages in this blog. So you can check that out. You have DDL, DML, DCL, TCL as well as DQL. And now let's move on to the question number 2. The question number 2 is, what is the difference between delete and truncate statement? Now, this can be one of the most commonly asked questions in an SQL interview. Now, this is a pretty simple question, but I have seen personally when I have taken interviews, when I ask these questions, not everyone is able to answer this question very comfortably or very confidently. So it's important that you understand the difference between these two statements. We know that delete and truncate can be used to remove data from the table, but what exactly is the difference? What are the things that you can do in a delete that you cannot do in a truncate, and why do people use truncate? Like, what are the advantages? The main advantage is that truncate is much faster. So let's say you want to delete a table which has, let's say, 1,000,000 records. Then if you try to use the delete statement, it's going to be very slow. Rather, if you try to use a truncate statement, it's going to be much faster. Now, I have not explained the details on why truncate is faster than delete, but this is basically one of the reasons. And truncate is a DDL, whereas a delete belongs to the DML language. So there are a few differences which I have mentioned in my blog. Do check that out. So this is the second question. Now let's move on to the third question. The third question again is going to be a very simple question, that is, why do we use case statement in SQL? Give example. So case statement is similar to the if-else statement that you would find in any other programming languages. Even though this may be a very simple concept, you would not believe that how often case statement is used when we write SQL queries. So even though it's a very simple thing, it's so widely used that you can expect to be asked a question on case statement. So it's always good to be thorough with case statement when you're attending an SQL interview. Okay. Now let's move on to the question number 4. So the question number 4 is actually a very important question. That is, what is the difference between left, right, full outer join and inner join? Now, a lot of you guys have asked me in comments as well, like can I make videos on joins and etc. So I plan to make a detailed video on all types of joins in SQL pretty soon. But I think if you are trying to understand what are the difference between the different types of joins in SQL, then I highly recommend that you read everything that I have mentioned in this blog. Now, basically, when you go to an interview, the interviewer basically may show you a couple of tables and then tell you when you do a left join, what would be the result, and when you do a full outer join, what would be the result. So the question might be something like this. So that is why I have presented here two different tables. I have shown you the data of these tables, and then for each of the joins, so I'm starting with inner join. I have explained you what inner join is, and then I have written the query, and then I have shown you the output that you would get by doing an inner join. And then the same thing I have done for left join, and then for right join, and then for full outer join. So just by looking at these queries and the data that is written from these type of joins, and also the explanation that I have given, you should be able to understand what is the difference between these joins. Now, not only this, I've also mentioned the other types of joins. So self join, what is self join, what some examples to that, and then what is natural join, and then also explain what is cross join. So if you want to get a complete understanding of joins, do check this blog out. And definitely if you're going for an SQL interview, you should be thorough with joins. And I think just by looking at this blog and looking at all of these examples and then trying to replicate all of these queries in your own system, I think you'll get a pretty good understanding of joins. So definitely be prepared to answer some questions on joins. Okay, so let's move on to the next question. So the question number 5 is, what is the difference between distinct and group by? Now, this also can be a pretty common question that can be asked in an SQL interview. Now, I think if you are pretty new to SQL, then you can get confused on what is the difference between distinct and group, because by using both of them, we can fetch unique records, right? But there is a major difference between distinct and group. They are not similar in any way. So, and I have explained everything in this blog. So do check that out and definitely get complete understanding of when to use a distinct statement and when to use a group by statement and why do we use both of these statements. Okay, so let's move on to the next question, and that is going to be the question number 6. The question number 6 states that what are the rules to follow when using union operator? Now, similar question can be asked for any other operators like union, all, intersect or minus. Now, there are certain rules that you need to follow when you want to join couple of queries by using any of these operators. And the rules I have mentioned here, you can definitely check the answers in my blog. So let's move on to the next one, the question number 7. So that is, what are aggregate functions, and name and explain different types of aggregate functions. Now, if you would see that most of these questions that I have here are more than questions, they are something like the complete SQL concepts. That is because now under this concept, there can be several types of questions that an interviewer can ask. For example, an interviewer might ask you to write a query where you have some employee table and asks you to count the total number of employees in each department. Now, in order to write that kind of query, you will have to use an aggregate function, and that is why you need to understand what aggregate functions are and how you can use aggregate functions. So that is why I have explained each of the different types of aggregate functions: sum, average, min, max, and count. And also I have mentioned you can use aggregate functions without the group by clause that I have mentioned here, and also you can use the aggregate functions with the group by clause. So you would find both examples here, and also you would find some explanations to these aggregate functions. So do check that out and do be familiar with aggregate functions, because I think that if you are attending an SQL interview, a question on aggregate function would definitely arise. Okay, so let's move on to the next question, and that is going to be the question number 8, and that is, what is the difference between rank, dense rank, and row number window function? Now, I can guarantee you one thing. If you are attending an SQL interview, you will definitely have a question on window function, because window function is so widely used for all sort of things on SQL. So here I have basically asked what is the difference between rank, dense rank, and row number, and I have taken a particular table for example, and then I have explained these three functions, and then I have basically shown you a table where you would see the difference between what is the value of rank, what is the value of dense rank, and what would be the value of row number. Okay, hopefully with this you would understand the difference between these three types of window function. But I would say that you should not only learn these three window functions, but also all the other window functions. So that is what I have mentioned here. You have other window functions like lead, lag, cum dist, end tile, last value, first value, and few others. So I have already made separate videos covering all of these window functions in detail. So you should be checking out my videos to completely understand all of these window functions. You'll find a link to that in this blog here. So definitely prepare to answer some questions on window functions that I can guarantee that you would have questions on window function in an SQL interview. Okay, so let's move on to the next question. That is question number 9. And the question is, can we use aggregate function as window function? If yes, then how do we do it? Now, this can be a tricky question if you are not comfortable or familiar with window functions. So we know that we have aggregate functions like sum, average, min, max, count, but all of these aggregate functions can be used as window function. And the simplest way of doing that, or basically the only way of doing that, is just by using the over clause. So here I have given you an example query. That is, this is the query: select sum of salary from managers, and you would see an output. And then I have shown you how you can use that as a window function by just using the over clause. That is, select sum of salary over, and inside over I have not mentioned partition by or order by because it is not mandatory. You can simply use over, and this will just convert, or basically SQL is going to treat your sum aggregate function as a window function. So the result would be slightly different, and that is what I have explained in this blog. So definitely check that out. Okay, so let's move on to the next question, and that is question number 10, which says, how can you convert a text into a date format? Consider the given text as 31-01-2021. Okay. Now, again, this can also be a very common question. That is a question on date format. How do you convert a particular text to a particular date format? Okay. So you should be familiar in using some functions that you can use to convert text to date format, and what are the different types of formats that you can convert a date to. Okay. Now, different RDBMS would have different functions to do this, and that is why what I have done is I have provided the solution in 4 of the most popular RDBMS today. That is Oracle, MySQL, Microsoft SQL Server, and PostgreSQL. So you'd find a solution to all of these 4 RDBMS in this blog. So definitely check that out, and definitely be prepared to answer some questions on some date formats. Okay, so let's move on to the next question. And the next question is the question number 11. And I'm going to read this question. So the question says, imagine there is a full name column in a table which has value like Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, etc. So each full name has a first name, a space, and a last name. So the question is, which function would you use to fetch only the first name from this full name column? Okay, and give an example. So basically what I'm asking is, try to fetch a substring or a particular string from a given text. Okay, and this, trust me, this is so widely used when we do some data analysis or some data extraction or write some SQL queries. So this is very widely used. So you should be familiar with what are the functions that you can use to fetch a particular string from a given text. And that is why I have included this question here. Now, as again, different RDBMS would have different functions to perform this operation, and that is why I have given my solution in 4 of the most popular RDBMS. You would find a solution for this question in Oracle, in MySQL, in Microsoft SQL Server, and PostgreSQL. Now, there is one thing to remember. To perform the same operation, you can use different functions as well. I have just used one particular function which I just remembered instantly, but of course you can solve the same operation by using some other functions, and the same goes for date format as well. So if you have a different solution to the same question, then definitely mention your solution in the comments below. I'll definitely be interested in knowing your solution. Okay, so let's move on to the next question, and that is the question number 12, which states, what are subqueries and where can we use them? Now, if you're writing SQL queries, I can guarantee you that you would have written subqueries, because I don't think so you can write any complicated or complex query without using subquery. So you definitely have to use subqueries, and so you definitely need to understand what subqueries are. So I've tried to explain in the most simplest of words what subqueries are, and also have given you an example. So definitely check that out, and also know where can you use subqueries. So you can use subquery in a select clause, in a from clause, in a where clause, and also you can use subqueries in different statements like insert, update, delete, etc. So I have mentioned all of that in this blog. So definitely understand subqueries before you attend an SQL interview. Okay, so let's move on to the next question, and that is the question number 13, which states, is it good to have the same subquery multiple times in your query? If no, then how you can solve it? So basically the question is, let's say you have a very big query where you have a particular subquery which is used multiple times in your query. So is it a good approach? And the answer to that is no. It's not a good approach to repeat the same subquery multiple times in your query. And the simple reason for that is, if you have the same subquery multiple times in your query, then SQL will have to execute the same query multiple times. Okay, rather if you just try to replace all of the subqueries and put the subquery inside a with clause and then just replace the subquery with the temp table name of your with clause, then it's going to really improve the performance, and also it's going to help with the maintenance, and that is what I have explained here. So definitely check that out and definitely try to write some queries to understand this better. Okay, so let's move on to the next question, and that is the question number 14, which basically states, what is the difference between where and having clause? Now, trust me, this is a question that not only the freshers but a lot of experienced SQL developers may also find it difficult to answer. Of course, we will know like where to use having clause and where to use the where clause, but trying to explain this to the interviewer might be a slightly tricky thing to do. So I have tried to explain the difference between these two in the most simplest of words in this blog. Try to go through that and definitely try to write some queries to understand where you can use a having clause and where you can use a where clause, and what are the different purposes of using both of these clauses in SQL. Okay, so let's move on to the next question, and that is the question number 15, which states, what are indexes and why do we use it? Now, I'm sure that if you're learning SQL, you might have heard of indexes, and probably you know that in order to improve the performance, we use indexes. But not everyone truly understand what indexes are. Okay, so when an interviewer will ask you what indexes are, if you try to explain index in the most simplest of terms, then that gives you the best chance of impressing your interviewer. And I can guarantee you that other than the freshers, maybe even for freshers, but mainly for the intermediate SQL roles or for the experienced or the senior SQL roles, a question on index is most definitely going to happen. And it's how you're going to explain indexes is actually going to play a very important role whether you pass this interview or not. So definitely spend some time in understanding what index is, and I have tried to explain what index is in the most simplest of terms. So you may see that this answer is quite big, but it's actually, I've tried to explain it in the most simplest of terms. Definitely check this answer and let me know if you understand it. If you want me to make a separate video on indexes, I can do that in the future. But for now, just try to get the most basic understanding of indexes, and definitely do not attend an interview without understanding what index is. Okay, so let's move on to the next question, and that is the question number 16. And the question is, what are the steps that you would take to tune a SQL query? Now, this is not a question that an interviewer would ask a fresher, but it's always better to understand how you can improve the performance of your query. And I think if you're applying for a senior SQL role, then this can definitely be one of the must questions that you should be expecting to be asked by the interviewer. Now, personally, when I have to tune a SQL query, there are 4 steps that I follow, and that is what I have mentioned here. Okay, so the first step is I need to basically check the SQL query. So whatever the query that we have written, there are so many ways that we can improve the query that we have written. Okay, now if you are using very huge tables, we can definitely make sure that we only consider the data that we need from this table before we join this table with some other tables. Now, if a table has a lot of columns, do we really need all of those columns? We can reduce the number of columns. Now we can replace the multiple subqueries with a with query, and there are so many different ways that you can write and improve the SQL query that you have written. So this definitely is the first step. Once you have made sure that the query is written in the best possible way that you can write, then the next step is, have you created indexes for all the tables that you're using? Okay, especially for all the huge tables that you'll be using. Okay, and are the correct indexes being created? Because there are different types of indexes which perform differently. So you should be aware that you should be using the correct index for a particular table. So that's definitely one thing. So I'm going to check if indexes are created. The third thing is, I'll check if the statistics are generated for all the tables and if the statistics are up to date. Okay, and the fourth thing is, I'll check the explain plan. Now explain plan will basically provide you the step-by-step guide of how the execution of the query happens by the optimizer. So basically you need to look at the explain plan, and basically reading an explain plan is also a different task, and that's something that you need to learn. But you don't need to be an expert of reading explain plan. You just need to understand the most basic things like, is an index being used and what types of joins is happening. So just by understanding most basic things of explain plan, you'll understand what is going on, and you can then follow these 4 steps once again to try to improve the performance of this query. So that is basically what I have explained in this question. Okay. Okay, so now let's move on to the next question, that is question number 17, and that is what is the difference between primary key, unique key and foreign key. Now this is the most basic question that can be asked, so you should be familiar with all of these constraints. Now there are other constraints as well, but I think these three are the most basic or most commonly used constraints, and you should definitely be aware of constraints when you're going for an SQL interview, even if you're a fresher or if you're applying for an intermediate SQL role. Okay, so here I have explained you what is the difference between primary key and unique key, and also explained you what foreign key is. So definitely go through this in my blog. Now let's move on to the next question, that is question number 18, and that is what is the difference between a weave and a synonym. Now my ultimate idea of asking this question is I want you guys to be aware of what are weaves, and you should be aware of what are synonyms and what is the difference between them. Okay, so I've tried to explain them here. Definitely we use weaves so many different times, and we also use synonym a lot of times. So you should know both of these concepts, and you should kind of know what is the difference. The difference is pretty simple actually, but understanding what synonym is and why we use synonym is very important, and understanding why do we use weave is also very important. So definitely be comfortable with both of these concepts, especially I would say weaves, before you attend an SQL interview. Okay, so let's move on to the next question, that is the question number 19, and that states when can a function not be called from select query. Now we know that in our select query we can call functions, right? Like average, sum, min, max, or the window function. These are all functions, but these are all inbuilt functions that are provided by the database. Okay, but then we can create our own functions which are user defined functions, and we can call those functions in select statement as well. But there is a rule when we create such functions. So we cannot just call any function from select statement. There is a rule that we need to follow, and that is basically we cannot change the state of the database, or we cannot change the data in the table in a function. That is, we cannot basically use the DML statements like insert, update, delete inside a function. So let's say you have written a function which does some insert, update, delete, some commits, rollbacks, etc. Then such kind of functions cannot be called from a select statement, and that is what this question is about. Okay, now let's move on to the next question, and that is question number 20. What is a trigger? Now, if you are attending an interview for a senior role, definitely there's going to be a question on trigger. And it's not just about telling what trigger is, what are the different types of triggers. You should also be familiar with, is it a good practice to use triggers? So try to get some understanding of triggers, and be prepared to answer some questions on triggers, especially for a senior role. But for a freshers and for, I would say for a fresher role, I don't think so a lot of questions about trigger would be asked, but definitely you should know what trigger is and what is the difference between a trigger and a procedure. Okay, there's one major difference, that is procedure is called by us, right? We call a procedure, we create a procedure and we execute the procedure ourselves, but a trigger cannot be executed by us. It happens automatically based on certain events that can occur in the database. Okay, so you need to understand the basics of triggers, and that is why this question. So try to understand triggers and go through this question in my blog. Okay, so let's move on to the next question. That is a question number 21, and that states what is the difference between a weave and a materialized weave. Now, I already covered weaves in the previous question. Now, there is another concept called as materialized weave, and it's one of the most important concepts, especially if you are attending a senior SQL interview role. But even for a junior SQL interview role, it's always good to know the concepts, okay, even though you might not have used it. So what exactly is a materialized weave and how is it different from weave? That is what you should be aware of, and that is what this question is about. So you'll find the answer to that in this blog. So definitely check that out. Moving on to the next question. The next question is, what is a merge statement? Now, merge is part of the DML statement, and it kind of does both update and insert based on certain conditions. So definitely try to understand what merge is. I have definitely been part of interviews where they asked me what merge was, and also asked me to write the syntax of merge. So definitely have some understanding of merge statements before you attend an SQL interview. Okay, so let's move on to the question number 23, and the question is, which functions can be used to fetch yesterday's date? Okay, so basically this is one of the questions that was asked by one of my subscribers, and I felt that this can actually be a pretty good question. If I was taking an interview tomorrow, this can actually be a pretty good question that I might ask, not for a very senior role, but maybe for a beginner or for an intermediate role. So definitely check how you can do that. Now, again, for different RDBMS, you would have different functions to solve this question. So basically what you need to do is, you need to find what was yesterday's date. So in order to find what was yesterday's date, you need to first understand or find what is today's date. So different RDBMS VMS have different functions to find today's date, and once you find today's date, you may have to use different functions to subtract one day from it to get yesterday's date. And the solution for that in Oracle, MySQL, Microsoft SQL Server, and PostgreSQL is mentioned in my blog. So definitely check that out. Moving on to the question number 24, that is, what is the difference between a function and a procedure? Trust me, I have been asked this question when I was a beginner in my career so many different times, and I have taken interviews where I have asked this question, and trust me, a lot of guys have not been able to clearly answer this question. They will know one difference, but they may not know all the difference. So definitely check what is the difference between a procedure and a function. I've tried to provide three different differences here. There may be more difference as well. Check that out as well. But definitely one of the most frequently asked questions if you are a beginner or applying for an intermediate SQL role. Okay. Now let's move on to the last question, and the last question is, what is Pragma autonomous transaction? Now, if you're a beginner, then I don't think so you would be asked this question. But let's say if you're applying for an intermediate role or for a senior role, then Pragma autonomous transaction can actually be one of the most commonly asked questions. Now, it's a very special concept in SQL or in databases that will let a particular procedure to have kind of its own session. Okay, so I have tried to explain this concept in the most simplest of terms. You can see the answer is pretty long, but I have basically given an example and tried to explain that. Definitely go through this and try to understand what Pragma autonomous transaction is. Okay, so finally I have used some tables and some example queries in this blog. So everything you would find in this download script. So you can just click on this download script button to download the text file, which will basically have all of those scripts. So that's all, guys. These were the top 25 SQL questions that I felt is something that you should be aware of. Now, it's not just about these 25 questions, but also about all the concepts that were covered in this SQL questions. So if you are familiar and comfortable with all the concepts that were covered in these 25 SQL questions, and if you are familiar with all the SQL queries that I have provided in my other videos, then I can guarantee you that you will be able to clear almost any SQL interview. So if you found some value in this video, then please make sure to subscribe to the channel and give me a thumbs up. Thank you, and see you soon in the next one. Bye.